Okay, thanks for being here, everybody. Before I introduce Mike Luo, I want to note that it's very fitting to have Mike here as our first John McCandlish Phillips journalism lecturer. John McCandlish Phillips, a celebrated reporter at the New York Times in the 1960s and 70s, was a dear friend to several journalists in New York City, such as Mike, myself, and several others in this room. We're pleased to celebrate his legacy by naming our boutique Journalism Institute here at King's in his honor. As part of that, the Institute is helping to boost curriculum in news journalism here at King's. We're inviting students from other colleges to study with us while interning in New York City. We're hosting events like this one to foster understanding of journalism and Christianity and the notion that those two realms are not so foreign to one another. So we hope Mike Luo can shed some light on that topic this evening. Mike has worked at the New York Times since 2003. He was recently named Deputy Metropolitan Editor, directing a team of reporters focusing on investigations and long-form narratives. Before this promotion, he was a reporter on the investigative team. His recent series explored gaps in gun laws and their impact on public safety. He covered presidential campaigns in 2012 and 2008. He's written about economics and the recession as a national correspondent. He's served reporting stints for the Times in Washington and in Baghdad. Before the Times, Mike reported for the Associated Press, Newsday, and the Los Angeles Times. I know that he's received a mantle full of awards, including a George Polk Award and a Livingston Award for young journalists. A little more background, he was a 1998 graduate of Harvard University, where he majored in government and worked on the school newspaper. He lives in Manhattan with his wife and 2 children, both girls, and a new one, I know. So we're doubly happy he's here with a new baby. And they attend Redeemer Presbyterian Church. So please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Mike Luo.
So, is this on? Yes, it was a little bit of a persuasion job to convince my wife to let me be here. Our second daughter was born on January 14th, so we are in the lack of sleep phase still. So I thought I'd open this talk with a little bit of a war story. So I've been in a lot of hostile environments as a reporter, so I did some visual aids here. So I was in Baghdad when the violence there was at its peak. Here's 2 stories on that. I've written a lot of tough stories about guns, taking on the gun lobby, and looking at gaps in gun laws. And part of that, I had my picture posted on a website called ammoland.com. Where you can, if you can't read the caption there, it says biased anti-gun NY Times reporter Mike Luo. So I've also covered, as Paul mentioned, 2 presidential campaigns. This one's from 2008. This story's from 2012. Some tough stories in those. But I've got to say the most overt hostility I've ever encountered as a reporter for the New York Times, more than Baghdad, more than presidential campaigns, more than taking on the gun lobby, was when I went to the Values Voters Summit in 2008. For those of you who don't know, the Values Voters Summit is this gathering of Christian conservatives, a lot of evangelicals, organized by the Family Research Council. So I had to do a story about the conference that's right here. So that meant going up to people and saying that I was from the New York Times and asking if they'd be willing to chat with me. And so I'm not kidding you here. Like, people literally were sneering at me after I introduced myself. At one point, I struck up a conversation with this nice-looking couple, nice-seeming couple, and they were, cautious, understandably at first. And I mentioned to them, in the course of the conversation, that I went to church and I was a believer, so that put them at ease. So then they introduced me to this, fairly prominent Christian conservative leader who was walking by, and but they immediately reassured him that don't worry, he goes to church. And his response was, well, he'll have to prove it. And so I was thinking what I was going to have to do, like, quote my favorite Bible verses or give him the 4 spiritual laws. Eventually, he moved on. But so probably a lot of you guys that your greatest fear is to be at a cocktail party where you don't know anybody. Imagine being a New York Times reporter at the Values Voters Summit. So I share this story just to highlight the sort of broad perception that's out there that obviously the reason I got that hostility at the conference was because of this the widespread belief that the Times is dominated by secular elites who are hostile to faith. And so probably the biggest question a lot of you have in this room is the paper of record biased against Christians and evangelicals in particular? So as a believer who's worked at the New York Times for more than a decade, I can tell you that that perception is misguided in a lot of ways. My willingness to be here is testament to that. I didn't have to say yes when Paul asked me to do this, to talk about my faith in such a public forum. More proof might be recently I organized a breakfast of other believers at the Times. I don't pretend to know the face of everybody at the New York Times, but these were just people I've encountered over the years who are also believers, and a lot of them thought it'd be nice to get together to have fellowship. There was a sports reporter, there was 2 reporters from Biz Day, our business section, one of whom used to be a pastor of a Vineyard church. So, talk about not judging a book by its cover. There was a fairly high-level editor there, a designer, a developer. There were other people who couldn't make it, and people are already asking, to meet up again. So there's that. But on the other hand, the Times is like a lot of other elite cultural institutions, filled with cosmopolitan, urban types, highly educated people who went to top colleges, whose cultural sensibilities are probably more shaped, by the Upper West Side and Park Slope, Brooklyn, than, the Bible Belt. So it's certainly not the easiest place to say you're a Christian. In fact, some of those people at that breakfast who have confided their faith with me at the paper have often sworn me to secrecy. And yes, it's true that I'm here today, but I did wonder, how much to broadcast it. Paul is telling me to market it and put it on my Facebook page and my Twitter feed, and so I did put it on my Facebook page, but I didn't say much about it. And then obviously the bottom line that the biggest question obviously that I raised is, while the paper does place the highest premium on reporting the news free from bias, do we screw up our coverage of Christians sometimes? Of course we do. But I would submit that when we screw up, it's not because of some sort of overt prejudice. The problem usually is you can't know what you don't know. So a lot of reporters at the New York Times don't know any evangelicals, or know very, very, very few. Many, maybe they've set foot in church, but it was probably a long time ago for a lot of them. And obviously they have worldviews that are very different in a lot of cases from evangelicals. So they might not know that evangelical is a theological orientation, not necessarily a political one, that there's a difference between fundamentalism and evangelicalism. That plenty of evangelicals do not believe the earth was created in 6 24-hour days, that not all evangelicals believe in the rapture. But so ignorance can obviously lead to inaccurate and misleading characterizations. And yes, it can lead to bias sometimes seeping through in the way Christians are depicted. Along these lines, the problem is usually not I would say basically almost never, if ever, our regular religion reporters. Where we trip up usually is when a national correspondent winds up writing about religion for some reason, a foreign correspondent, a styles reporter somehow venturing into religion. So it's generalists who don't know the issues and don't know the sensitivities. So what then is my responsibility as a Christian at the New York Times? What is the kingdom purpose for me being there? So these are questions I think about, pray about, wrestle with all the time. So the interesting thing I've come to realize is that some of the ways that my presence at the Times benefits the kingdom also benefits the New York Times. So let me sort of go into that. So after college, when I decided to become a Christian in college, so my background, we didn't explain that at all in the little intro. So I didn't grow up a Christian. I became a Christian at Harvard. I won't give you my whole testimony about that. So when I was making the sort of career decisions, this was clearly a time when I was on fire for God. And so at the time, and I went to Urbana, the missions conference, and a lot of that stuff was very heavy on my mind as I was sort of thinking about my future. And so at the time, the biggest thing I thought I could do in journalism was make a difference. So one of my favorite verses then and now is Micah 6:8, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So unlike a lot of other professions out there, and I won't get into them, including many that are around here in Lower Manhattan, there are plenty of opportunities in journalism to do justice and to love mercy. It's a big reason, I became an investigative reporter. When I was a very young national writer at the Associated Press, I wrote a story, a 3-part series on 3 poor black mentally retarded people who were in prison in Alabama for killing a baby that probably never existed. The series resulted in 2 of the 3 people eventually going free. The 3rd stayed in prison on an unrelated charge. That's doing justice. A story that I did last year on domestic violence and guns that recently led to a law being changed in Washington State, which is the state that I focused on in this story. That's also doing justice. The Dasani story that a lot of you probably read, the 5-part giant series about a child growing up in one of the most these horrific conditions in this homeless shelter in New York, done by a close friend of mine. That's definitely loving mercy. So that's like a very sort of obvious sort of purpose, kingdom purpose for me in journalism. But over time, I've come to see that there are at least 2 other purposes for me being at the Times, kingdom purposes. Ones that are a lot more complicated, ones that sort of require a lot more internal wrestling. So some people might say, oh, you're at the New York Times to bring Christian truth to the pages of the Times. This kind of language makes me really uncomfortable because of how ingrained it is in me to bring, no agenda to what I report and write. I know some of you might actually ridicule that notion that the Times is objective, but I don't claim, as I said, I don't claim that our track record is unblemished, but there's a tremendous amount of effort. You would be shocked, really, at the amount of effort and thought that goes into that value every single day at the paper. So in that vein, though, a major thing I've come to conclude that I can contribute to the Times, as well as the kingdom and the church, is doing my best to ensure that we cover Christianity fairly and accurately, making sure we're not only covering a certain segment of Christians while neglecting others, or that we're not using loaded language in our stories, we're not mistakenly conflating theological terms with political ones. So another kingdom purpose for me being at the paper, I think, is just to let the world know that, yes, there are Christians at the New York Times, just as there are Christians who are doctors, lawyers, and scientists, who are humanitarians, environmentalists, and professional basketball players, and on and on. So these 2 purposes, these 2 other purposes about the consistent, the accuracy and fairness and coverage of Christians, and then letting the world know that there are Christians at the New York Times, these purposes require a lot more grappling, because they mean, first and foremost, that I have to be willing to step up and be counted as a Christian at the New York Times. It means I can't hide. And that's something I struggle with all the time. So some of the reasons I struggle with this, that hold me back in terms of this willingness sort of to be counted, are very specific to journalism. As I said, that Times reporters go to enormous lengths to avoid creating any kind of appearance that we might be biased in any way. A lot of this might surprise you, but a lot of political reporters at the Times and elsewhere don't even vote. So identifying publicly as a Christian creates a lot of complications in my journalism life. I've always grappled with whether being public about my faith impacts my ability to cover certain kinds of stories. And now I'm an editor, I worry about whether it impacts my ability to edit those stories. So other issues that I wrestle with that hold me back from being willing to be counted are ones that probably, others of you here in the room can relate to. Non-journalism reasons, like the fear of what these other very smart, sophisticated people at the paper and outside of it, in the world of the people I cover, will think of me. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my journey on that front as well. So when I came to the paper in 2003, and there was actually a little bit of providence, I think, looking back when I came. This was right when the Jason Blair episode happened. For those of you who don't remember, Jason Blair was this young, up-and-coming Times reporter who we found out was making up stories, and it was a giant blot on the New York Times. And so in the aftermath of that episode, there were two committees set up. One to investigate what happened, and there was another committee that was set up to sort of improve the credibility of the paper and look at draft recommendations for how to do that. So interestingly, you can actually go look up this report still. It's still online. A good chunk of the report on the credibility report was actually about religion. Here are some of the recommendations from the report. I won't read all of them to you. One was, our news coverage needs to embrace unorthodox views and contrarian opinions and to portray lives both more radical and more conservative than most of us experience. We need to listen carefully to colleagues whose homes and realms are not familiar to most of us. We should increase our coverage of religion in America and focus on new ways to give it greater attention. Our paper's commitment to a diversity of gender, race, and ethnicity is non-negotiable. We should pursue the same diversity in other dimensions of life, and for the same reason, to ensure that a broad range of viewpoints is at the table when we decide what to write about and how to present it. So it seems shocking to me now, actually, looking back, because I was such a, I was a cub reporter, barely, at the paper. But I actually took the opportunity to write to some of the top editors of the paper to explain that, yes, I actually am a believer, and I have some ideas or thoughts about our coverage of religion. I emailed Bill Keller, who was the executive editor at the paper at the time. So that led to me actually I was like this 27-year-old reporter, very new to the paper, giving a seminar in the newsroom about the meaning of evangelicalism. And then at the time I was a reporter on the Metro desk, and I covered transportation, very Metro beat. I was doing a project on Medicaid fraud. But because of this, because of me sort of raising my hand, I started branching out and writing occasionally about religion for the Week in Review section. Today is the Sunday Review section. So I have some of those here. I'm probably the first and last person to explain in the pages of the New York Times dispensationalism, what that means, and the end times. And this actually, a bunch of these pieces I did for the Week in Review led to me eventually covering religion for the Metro section. So I only covered religion for a very short while, like probably about a year, maybe even less than that. But it was enough time to write about a remarkably media-averse pastor at the time named Tim Keller. So when I covered religion, I just wanted to say a little bit about coverage of religion. I tried to write about religion in the way I thought it should be covered. I think that I tried as much as possible to write about how faith plays out in people's lives. A problem I see time and again in religion coverage at the Times and elsewhere is that religion is written from the perspective of conflict. It's A versus B, it's this institution opposed to that. This is not just a problem of our religion coverage, it's a problem of our political coverage, it's a problem of a lot of other things that we cover. Why do we do this? It's because it's easier. When A is against B, there's news there. There's a lead, you can write a nut graph. So these other stories that I want to do about faith playing out in real ways in people's lives, those are harder to tell. So I've since gone on from the religion beat to cover the war in Iraq, Congress, presidential campaign, the recession. Most recently, I've been a reporter in the investigative unit. But so, in other words, I haven't had a direct hand in religion coverage these days. But because of how I spoke up back then, I kind of became the resident consultant at the paper about evangelicals and our coverage of evangelicals. So sometimes editors will come up to me and ask my opinion on stories. I've helped shape our coverage, and it helped us avoid certain mistakes. And along the way, when I was in Iraq and Washington and all these other places, I still found a way to write about faith. In Iraq, I wrote about Iraqi Christians, which was pretty amazing. In 2008, I wrote about Hillary Clinton's faith. Maybe I'll do the story again in a couple years. And I even got to talk to her about it. But here's where the wrestling comes in. So I continue to grapple with how often to speak up. I still think too often our religion cover is done through the lens of conflict and the culture wars. I think we continue to make mistakes in lumping evangelicals, Christian conservatives, and fundamentalists all together when they don't mean the same thing. Sometimes I read certain stories and I shake my head. Sometimes it's a phrase, sometimes it's labeling someone in a way that they shouldn't be labeled. Oftentimes it's a failure to appreciate nuance. So sometimes I have spoken up, but I confess that at other times I've just sort of sighed and turned the page. So I definitely don't think that we have fulfilled the mandate that the credibility report talked about. We still don't do a good enough job in covering religion. We still fall down in some of these areas that the credibility report talked about in terms of diversity of viewpoints and other things like that in the newsroom. So I've wondered, whether I should talk to someone about that. Should I say more about this? So what holds me back? Apathy, perhaps. Sometimes I'm just busy focusing on what I'm supposed to be doing, my day job. I ask God, why? I'm not your, I don't know. I don't want to be your sort of sole agent, of change at the New York Times. There's too much pressure. But there's also this fear that probably some of you guys can relate to, a fear of being the religious zealot at the paper. I don't want people to see me one-dimensionally as that Jesus freak guy. So something else happened just a little bit more on this journey of sort of how often sort of to speak up. Something else happened a couple years ago, 2 years ago. That was, I think, providential. And if you're from the city and you were around back then, you know what I'm talking about. Yes, Lynn Sanity, an Asian American basketball player from Harvard, who also happened to be a Christian, became the toast of this city. So Jeremy Lin's rise actually gave me this really unusual opportunity to come out in the most public way I ever have about my faith. When Linsanity was sort of unfolding, that first like 8 days when he was on fire, the sports editor of the Times, who knew about my faith, reached out to me and asked me, if I had some thoughts on him. And a couple of days later, he emailed me and asked if I might consider writing a personal essay on Lynn through the lens of my ethnicity and my faith. So I told him that this is kind of actually pretty vulnerable. He said, "I'm all about vulnerability." So I wrestled with it for a few days, and then in the end, I turned in a very personal essay about Jeremy Lin and my own faith and what it means to be an Asian American Christian specifically. The piece generated a huge reader response, especially on Twitter. It was, I think, the most tweeted story on the New York Times. It was just this little story in the back of the sports section. It was the most tweeted story on the New York Times, on nytimes.com that weekend. I think second to, I think Whitney Houston died that weekend, so Whitney Houston beat my little essay on Jeremy Lin and my faith. So a lot of the emails I got were from readers who were like me, in professions where it's sometimes difficult to identify as a Christian, and they thank me for what I wrote. So my whole journey on this took another turn a few weeks ago. As Paul alluded to, I became deputy Metro editor. So in my new job, I'm helping run the Metro desk. I'm the number 2 person in the department with another person who's also a deputy. So I was brought in mainly because the higher-ups of the paper felt like the Metro department needed more investigative muscle. And so I was brought in to start this investigative team, my main focus really is to sort of concentrate on that. But the current Metro editor, Wendell Jameson, who happened to be my editor back when I covered religion on Metro, knew about my faith, obviously, asked me to consider handling religion as well. And so at first I confess that I resisted. I was worried for journalistic reasons. I didn't want to distract me from my main job, which was handling the investigations team. But honestly, another factor was just that, once again, I had that fear of standing up and being counted again. It's honestly just easier to avoid these things. But Wendell, rightly, I think now, pressed me to take it on, and so I have now. So now there's definitely no hiding. So we'll see how it goes, but it's interesting to me how it's come to this. I'm no longer the one offering some thoughts here and there on our coverage of religion, emailing some of the big bosses what we should do. I am one of the bosses. But just to be clear, my agenda is to ensure that we cover Christianity just as we do other religions fairly, objectively, and accurately. In that way, I think I'm helping the kingdom and the New York Times. So that's it. Thank you.